We're so glad to have so many participants joining us today, and we're going to get started right away. My name is Kristina Robertsi. I'm the Legal Initiatives Manager at IntegralOrg, and I will be facilitating this afternoon's presentation discussion. The webinar today is brought to you by IntegralOrg, along with our co-hosts, the Edmonton Chamber of Voluntary Organizations and Fuse Social. IntegralOrg is a go-to problem solver for Alberta nonprofits and charities. We offer a comprehensive suite of services that build organizational capacity in foundational areas like governance, legal compliance, financial management, strategic planning, and risk management. ECVO is a member-based nonprofit organization serving nonprofit and charitable organizations in Edmonton to help them build and sustain their volunteer programs and services through resources, networking, and skill development opportunities. Fuse Social is a capacity building organization that helps strengthen social profits in Wood Buffalo through education, development, innovation, and collaboration activities that are accessible and relevant. We're grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with these wonderful organizations to support nonprofits across Alberta. Together, we acknowledge that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples presently subject to Treaties 6, 7, and 8, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, Kainai, Piikani, and Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis people of Alberta. This includes the Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. We make this land acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside and work on today. June is Indigenous History Month in Canada, and in light of the horrific, recent, and ongoing discoveries of the remains of hundreds of children at former residential school sites, like the ones in Kamloops, BC, and Brandon, Manitoba, with thousands more still unaccounted for, we acknowledge the need to learn more about the experiences and lives of Canada's Indigenous peoples and the indignities and atrocities that they have suffered and continue to suffer. There's much more work to be done, and IntegralOrg is committed to learning what must be done personally and as an organization to actively participate in reconciliation. Thank you for joining me in making that acknowledgement. Just a couple of quick reminders about participating today via Zoom. So everybody, all the participants will be muted and you won't be able to turn on your camera throughout the session. However, you are free to use the chat function, and there will be time at the end of the session for the presenters to answer any questions that come up in the chat. And please note that the webinar today is being recorded, including any activity that takes place in the chat box. And the recording will be made available to all registrants within the next few days. So now I'd like to introduce our presenters. Yvonne Chenier is IntegralOrg's General Counsel and one of the co-founders of the organization. She brings more than 40 years of experience as a lawyer, advising those in the philanthropic, nonprofit, and social enterprise sectors. We also have Melissa Rico. Melissa is a partner at Carbert Waite LLP. One of her primary practice areas is employment law. She has extensive experience representing both employers and employees on a wide variety of matters, including termination of employment, employment contracts, human rights, privacy matters, policy drafting, and disability issues. She presents regularly at conferences on various employment issues. So just to provide an overview of the topics that we're going to cover today, Yvonne will start out by going over the occupational health and safety obligations of nonprofit employers related to COVID-19. Melissa will discuss the Employment Standards Code and providing paid leave for vaccination. She'll then delve into the human rights and privacy law implications of various vaccine policies. Yvonne and Melissa will then be happy to answer questions that have been submitted throughout the session. Throughout the presentation, I'm also going to interject every now and then to explain the concerns of Bob, our fictional nonprofit worker. So this is going to give us a chance to address some of the questions that some of the employees and volunteers in the audience might have, and some of the scenarios that you as nonprofit employers might anticipate facing. So just keep an eye out for Bob throughout. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Yvonne.
Thank you, Kristina. I think we really should have entitled this presentation where OHS, employment standards, privacy law, human rights, and constitutional law intersect. So there's a lot of issues we're going to be talking about today at a very, very high level. And the first one that I think is key to safety of everyone in the workplace is our occupational health and safety legislation that we have in the province of Alberta that has a lot to say about this point at this time. So we'll go to the next slide and I'll briefly talk about the amount of change that took place to the Occupational Health and Safety Act in 2018. Can we turn to the next slide, please? So on June 2018, a new Occupational Health and Safety Act came into effect in Alberta. And this applies to you, most of you anyway, because under that legislation, it's clear that an employer means and includes a charity or a nonprofit organization. And that's who this seminar is directed to today. A worker includes a volunteer, and I know many of you have volunteers. So the Act will cover you as far as your volunteers go. And work site means a location where a worker, meaning an employee or a volunteer, is or is likely to be engaged in any occupation, includes a vehicle or mobile equipment used by a worker, and probably includes a home as well. So there was far-reaching changes to the legislation in 2018, and IntegralOrg has done many sessions on the effects of that legislation and how nonprofits should be prepared. And on the next slide, I have the very specific information to our Occupational Health and Safety Toolkit that is on our IntegralOrg website, because all organizations must take reasonable precautions to protect the health and safety of their employees and volunteers. And that includes taking necessary measures to reduce the risk of transmission of COVID-19. So the Act specifically applies to organizations with a lot of administrative requirements if you have 5 or more workers. So that's why on our toolkit, you have some of the templates to download, you have the specifics of the legislation and what you have to do as an employer of workers. And I think it's quite comprehensive for you to get a start. Because what we know in this area is that having policies and procedures, and you'll find a little bit more as we talk about the other aspects of this presentation, policies and procedures are the offensive in this area. And as we know from a lot of other analogies, offense is usually the best defense. So be offensive, be prepared, get your policies and procedures in row. And one of the ones under the Occupational Health and Safety legislation that you'll see is you need a health and safety program. The preparation for these kinds of issues that we're talking about today, vaccinations or spread of any kind of infection at the workplace, has to be prevented by this coordinated system of procedures and processes that improve occupational health and safety, and of course prevent, that's the word, is prevent injury and illness in the workplace. So that's what organizations have to comply with in the area of occupational health and safety. Taking your precautions, doing your processes and procedures, and having your program in place. Next slide, please. So just so we have some fun, we're going to have a little poll. So the question we thought of is asking you, employers have a duty to provide a safe workplace and reduce exposure to COVID-19. That's what I've said from the Occupational Health and Safety legislation. So how important is that for your organization to know the vaccination status of its workers? And I see as the polling results are coming in, very important is seems to be winning, but somewhat important is coming in second place. There's only a few unsure people, but it seems that very important is going to win. So it seems that we want to have some sort of I'm going to X this out of my screen here. We need to have some sort of way to know the vaccination status of its workers. That's our wish anyway, but just like a lot of other things in our world, sometimes what we wish is not what we can obtain, certainly in a legal manner anyway. So the next slide after our poll talks about some essential steps that occupational health and safety would require of you, and it will go a long, long way to making your wish of and your desire to have a vaccination policy being very important to your workplace. So the most important thing you'll hear is review and communicate your policies. So first of all, review the policies. And again, if you don't have basic occupational health and safety policies that have been in place since June 1st, 2018, please get some and go on our toolkit if you need some guidance with that. These procedures have to be compliant with the legislative changes that have been made under the Act, the OHS laws, any other legislative changes that happen as this COVID-19 back to work vaccination thing develops, and any government directives such as those from our Alberta Health Services. So your policies should be written with all of those in mind. And of course, you need to communicate. There's nothing great about having a policy that sits on a shelf and nobody understands. Under occupational health and safety, the second most important thing after you have policies, as you will see, is to perform a hazard assessment. And you have to identify at your workplace what are the hazards related to everything, including COVID-19. So someone, and you'll see under the Act, it's either your representative or your Occupational Health and Safety Committee is responsible for performing this hazard assessment, filling out all these forms to make a record of the fact that you directed your mind to the fact that potentially COVID-19, catching it in the workplace might be a hazard of work. And then you need to address it. You've identified it, you have a policy, you identify it, and now how are you gonna deal with it? So as we have during COVID-19 itself, we've used a mix of administrative controls, such as don't come into work if you're sick, or don't come into work at all if you can work at home, and PPE, everyone wear masks, etc. To protect. Who are we protecting? We're protecting our workers. And of course, it depends on the kind of work site you have and the tasks that need to be performed. And finally, another essential step is to figure out what you are going to do as an employer. A nonprofit employer having employees and volunteers, what are you going to do as far as screening and testing and monitoring? How are you going to assess whether or not there is a risk in your workplace? So these are very key things that are basic for any kind of hazard, and COVID-19 is certainly the hazard of the day at this point. Next slide, please.
Okay, Yvonne, I'm going to interrupt because our friend Bob has some concerns about workplace safety. So Bob works for a nonprofit mental health center, and he doesn't want to come back to the office because he's concerned that the clients that the center serves could expose him to COVID-19. So what should Bob's employer do here?
So Bob is he's read maybe the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and he has figured out that one of the essential rights of a worker is to refuse dangerous work, potentially. So he maybe thinks that the workplace is dangerous, so he's simply just going to refuse to work. And under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, at least under this act, there's very specific steps that employers and workers have to go through to follow a decision tree of, so you've refused to work. So let's try and sort it out. What do you think is dangerous about the workplace? Potentially, Bob, as you said, would say, not everyone's been vaccinated, so therefore I don't want to go. And then there's a procedure in place you follow. And the ultimate thing is, if you can't work it out by putting Bob in a separate spot where he's not going to be in contact with anyone, potentially you would have an OHS complaint. So this is just one little slice of Bob's not wanting to come into work. Next slide, please. So you can prepare for all these work refusals. You have to prepare a policy and a procedure in case they refuse to work. The Occupational Health and Safety Act does have a lot of help for you, and the OHS bulletins on their Occupational Health and Safety Alberta website does too. Review those procedures, make sure that you're ready, and anticipate that employees like Bob or anyone else are going to have specific concerns. Not only they don't want to come into work, they don't like the corner of the office where they work, they don't like where the photocopier is. Anticipate all of these issues and come up with a communication plan for them. Very difficult, I know, but that's just the occupational health and safety. How about vaccinations? Oh, Melissa.
Before we get to vaccinations, we're just going to, well, it is part of it. Before we get to vaccination policies, we're going to speak a little bit about, well, your employee wants to go and get the vaccination, and that's great. And if you wouldn't mind, the next slide, please. As many of you probably know, in Bill 71, it was unanimously passed on April 21, 2021. I think it was almost instantaneous that it was passed. And it's essentially applying what's similar to the voting leave. So we want to encourage people to vote. We're going to encourage people to get their vaccination. So what this bill talks about is that employees are entitled to a 3-hour paid leave per dose. And I think I looked at stats yesterday, we're creeping up to 70%, right? So cheers to us and all the Albertans who have gone and got their prick. Where there's a bit of a gap is that we're only at 13% for fully vaccinated. And I know it's opening up for those in May who got their first dose. So hopefully we'll see that gap start to go away. But it is for both, right? So what you have to do is you essentially allow them, and what this whole bill was about was to encourage employees and employers to work together to schedule that vaccination. So obviously we want to allow for enough reasonable notice. So not, hey, I got my vaccination appointment, but you know what? It may happen that way. And that was what happened with me. I called that morning and I got it by 10 o'clock and I was out the door. What do you need to see? So we need to, as employers, can request reasonably sufficient proof. This isn't a need. You can request it. This is not saying, please give me a copy of your vaccination certificate or to disclose any other medical conditions. So what would be reasonably sufficient proof? Oh, here's my email that says that I have my appointment confirmed. Great. That's probably enough for you to allow for them to take this 3-hour leave. So not much more to be said about that. If we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about vaccination policies. And Yvonne was right to talk about, we're talking about a lot of different things of the interplay of OHS. We're going to talk about human rights. We're going to talk about charter briefly. We're going to talk about privacy, all at a very high level. And with the vaccination policies, if we could go to the next slide, which is a poll, we're going to talk about different components to the vaccination policies and what you could include. So if everyone wouldn't mind answering this, so has your organization implemented a COVID-19 vaccination policy? Yes, no, we're considering it, and I don't know. And I can't see the results, so I may have to ask Kristina to sort of give me a heads up. Oh, now I can't see it. Excellent. So we have 7% saying yes, 58% saying no, and 32% saying we're considering it. So let's move on. In terms of let me just close the screen, my apologies. With the vaccination policies, and Yvonne talked about offense being a good defense, and policies and procedures absolutely are 100% critical to employment and making sure that you're trying to solve problems in advance with your employees. With the vaccination policies, we're in a tiny bit of a little different field, and I'd say tread with caution. So it's great that we have 442 people here who are going to listen to some of the possible implications if they don't think twice before they implement certain types of vaccination policies. So the things I want you to consider as we go through these are, what am I going to include in a possible vaccination policy? So one of them is disclosure of vaccination status. And Yvonne talked about your wish to know. Sure, you have a wish to know. We're going to talk about privacy implications. Taking it a step farther, because I know many of you deal with vulnerable populations. I want them to be vaccinated. So we're going to talk about mandatory vaccination policies and is this a good idea? And then the last one we'll talk about is, I don't know how many of you have registered for this lottery with our government on incentivization. And I have not. My husband said, well, why haven't you? I said, I'm not a lucky person. So I don't know if I'm going to bother registering for that. But let's move to this mandatory vaccination policies. Oh, if we could go back, Kristina, sorry, I had actually meant to talk on the previous slide. So mandatory vaccination policies, as many of you know, there is not a mandatory vaccination legislation. And in fact, Alberta's been pretty clear they're not going to likely to do that. So what we're left with is employers can decide. And it's unlikely that all employers will be able to enforce mandatory vaccination policies. So one of the key takeaways in words will be it's very fact specific. So what may make sense in one workplace may not make sense in another workplace. And this is why I said tread cautiously. There is significant litigation risk to implementing a mandatory vaccination policy. And I'm going to give sort of a sliding scale to, I work in a law firm. Would I like everyone to be vaccinated? Absolutely. Is it necessary for me in terms of the population that I'm dealing with, meaning clients, my coworkers? No, I'd say no, because I'm not dealing with particularly vulnerable young or elderly or immunocompromised individuals. So slide the scale over, because I know many of you do deal with these populations. There may be more factors in favor of you having that mandatory vaccination policy. I'm going to give you another example. HS, that's where they're dealing with the most critical, I'd say, vulnerable population. It's not in all aspects of AHS. They do not have a mandatory vaccination policy. I did some quick Google research, love Google. And actually Ontario has a mandatory vaccination program, and this will come as no surprise in long-term care centers, right? So where are we dealing with those who are going to be most effective? They want their workers to have the vaccination. BC looks like they're entertaining it. Alberta has said that's likely not going to happen. So in Alberta, we're likely not to see that, but it is interesting that across a different province, there is a mandatory vaccination program in long-term care centers. So if we can move to the next slide. And this is human rights. So here's our first interfacing of, let's take a second look at this. Where mandatory vaccination policies are, does it discriminate? And where you're going to be running into some possible risk is if the person is saying, I can't have the vaccination for a medical contraindication, or because on religious reasons, I don't want to have it. And there is a difference between personal beliefs. So your personal belief to not have it is not a protected ground. And there are some court decisions that talk about the courts recognizing accepted systems of thoughts and belief and distinguishing that from a personal view. So keep that in mind as to what is this really based on, the person not wanting to have it. And of course, discrimination is likely if there's mandatory vaccinations tied to you continuing employment, because that's really where you're getting protection for the employee. So we're going to talk a little bit about accommodation.
Okay, and before we get to that, Bob has another issue. So Bob is not vaccinated because vaccinations are against his religious beliefs. So he believes that a mandatory vaccination policy would violate his freedom of religion under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Is Bob right? Does the charter apply here?
And the answer is no. It's likely no, because the charter really only applies to statutes, to law, not to employee. Or there might be some small exceptions to that, but we're going to keep it high level. So while Bob could say that Section 2A, which is the religious charter right, is being violated, if it was a mandatory law saying that you had to have it, he's not going to be able to argue that in the context of your not-for-profit organization implementing a mandatory vaccine. And where he really is going to have some ground would be under this human rights, right? So he would say, my protected ground is my religious belief. I do not wish for it. And now you're saying that whatever the consequences might be. So what are you saying, that he can't come in? That he has to wear masks, which is going to distinguish him from the others? Are you saying that he can't continue employment? So there's lots of nuance to this as well. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So accommodation. So accommodation, keep this in mind, is only triggered where we have a protected ground. So religion, a medical ground. And the basic starting point here is you have a duty to accommodate if it is on the protected ground. I don't want to get too much in these next points about the bona fide occupational requirement. It's still fun, our legalese, right? But there is a test, right, to go through it and say, well, is it reasonably necessary? What I really want you to walk away with, what's my key word today, is fact specific. And what may satisfy one workplace may not in the other. And the other thing to keep in mind, another keyword I'm going to throw in there, is balancing. So we're really balancing right to religion, right to personal choice, with right to trying to keep people safe. So what we're going to be looking at, and Yvonne touched on this, is are there any other intrusive, less intrusive measures that we can implement? Physical distancing, wearing masks, having people not come in, things like that. That are those more appropriate than having a mandatory vaccination rule? And again, procedural and substantive components, I don't want to get too much into this, but this touches on, in the context of accommodation, which I could spend hours talking about accommodation. It's really about what information are you allowed to elicit from your employee to come up with the appropriate accommodation. And the substantive component is really crafting the tailored accommodation strategies for that individual. So we can move to the next slide, please. And again, I want to take this pretty high level vaccination case law. So we're really new. I think Yvonne called it the new hazard, COVID-19. Well, if we think back, influenza is not that far off. It's an analogous, we have shots every year. So that's where we turn to in terms of, well, what's similar? And there was some vaccination case law. What's my keyword? Fact specific. And this was almost identical on the facts, but they looked at this and said, one, okay, it's reasonable, and the other was unreasonable. Keep in mind that these were not actual mandatory vaccinations, so it wasn't that or nothing. They actually had a mask as well. So back when it wasn't as common to see people wearing masks, it was vaccination or mask. What I think will be interesting as the case law comes out is the severity of COVID is far worse than influenza for most people, particularly for vulnerable populations. So that may increase the weight that's given to the employee's interest in protecting the safety of others. So we'll have to see what comes of it, but the courts are kind of back and forth on this, even on influenza. So we're going to move on to privacy. So we've touched on charter, we touched on OH&S, we touched on HR, and now we're going to talk a bit about privacy. And if you remember, I talked about what components should you consider in your policy. We've covered, should we have a mandatory stick your arm out and get the needle? Now we're going to talk about my wish for disclosure and my wish to know whether you are vaccinated. So if we can move to the next slide, we have another poll. So has your organization asked its employees or volunteers to disclose their vaccination status? We have yes, it was mandatory, yes, it was voluntary, and no. Just wait for the results to come up. And obviously one of the distinguishing features here is whether or not it's mandatory or voluntary. So I'll be interested to see what the poll results are. And here they are. Okay, so 70%, the overwhelming majority have said no. 29% said yes, and just 1% said yes, mandatory. So what I think is interesting is that I didn't write down the percentage of people who very much wanted to know the status, but it jives with only 70%. So it's, you want to know, but 70% haven't even asked, right? So in terms of collecting this privacy information, it's all going to fall within the oversight of, I always get this acronym mixed up, but it's Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner, which I always call OPIC, but it's OIPC. So that's really the officer of, and we're going to talk about the different pieces of legislation that fall under the OIPC, not OPIC. So we could go to the next slide, please.
Sure. Melissa, I'm just going to interrupt because you just had a clarifying question on the religious belief piece. Could you reiterate what the difference is between just a personal belief and a protected religious belief?
And to distill it down, it's really going to be, is it a recognized religion, right? So me saying I don't wish for it, and I'm not tying that to my beliefs in whatever religion I have, that's not good enough. So it's, again, fact specific, right? But you're going to have to be able to show what you're tying that to, in terms of what religion and what their beliefs and their foundations are.
Perfect. Okay, back to privacy.
Back to privacy. Yes. So we had the poll, now we're at vaccinations and privacy. So why are we all fussed about this? Well, because it's personal information, and in fact could be considered medical information, so health information. So it's going to be subject to privacy legislation, and that's going to talk about how do you collect it, how do you use it, how do you disclose it, how do you store it, how do you, things like that. The applicable legislation is actually silent, but it presumes that it is highly sensitive because it is medical information. And that's why I talked about the OIPC as sort of the overseer of all of these. If you go to the next slide, please, we'll talk about, well, what legislation are we talking about? For most of you, it will likely be, well, it depends if you engage in commercial enterprises. This is all new to me in terms of the not-for-profit world, but it's likely to be PIPA. And Yvonne, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think that it depends on whether you're having some sort of commercial transactions or enterprises there.
Correct, yes. At this point.
Always a moving target. There are other acts. I just wanted to highlight those. So more acronyms, PIPETA, which I actually don't interface with much because that's federal work. So, the airplane industry, I'm sure there's a nicer way to say that. Aeronautical, I don't know. My mind is not working completely right now. And then we have PIPA, which is talked about, FOIP, so that's provincial public. So for instance, AHS would fall under that. And then we have HIA, so the Health Information Act. He is pretty specific. So I don't want to get too much into it, but he would apply like if you're collecting, if you had like a medical chart. So for instance, I do know some not-for-profits will have psychologists on or other people who are providing healthcare services. So we're really looking around this definition of what a custodian is and are we falling in that. So again, I want to keep it pretty high level, but just to let you know what acts are out there that would fall under the privacy realm.
Okay, and Melissa, I have another quick question from Bob about Bob, I guess. So Bob's coworkers heard a rumor that he's not vaccinated, and they approached their employer asking to verify his vaccination status. So what kind of privacy implications does that have?
I would love to have a poll here to say, would you disclose it? And I'm hoping the overwhelming majority would say, no, you don't disclose it. And that's sort of a black and white to me, is that you don't disclose personal information, and you really want to make sure that disclosure is only to those who need to know. And nosy people, I don't mean that judgmentally, but they don't need to know other people's vaccination status. So next slide, please. So remember, one of my other keywords is balance. So again, just like the human rights aspect of it, we're really balancing the employer's obligation to ensure a safe workplace and the employee's right to privacy. And what's reasonable in the circumstances, you don't want to unnecessarily infringe on it. And really the question is that vaccine verification integral to ensuring a safe workplace? So next slide, please. This is interesting. So these vaccine passports, and they're verified proof that the person is vaccinated. And there's this joint statement by the federal, provincial, territorial privacy commissioners. So I printed it out. It's actually very short. So even printed, it's only 2.5 pages. And it talks a bit about, and it's coming from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. And it talks about vaccine passports. And the key with this is that for businesses and other entities that are subject to private sector privacy laws and are considering some form of vaccine passport, they would need some legal authority to do that. So that's that second point. And we don't have that legal authority yet. And unless Yvonne, you want to correct me on that, but I'm pretty sure that there's nothing yet. And we're talking about like under a public health order, or say there's a new bill coming out from the government that says now we can have these vaccine passports. So you tread really cautiously here because we don't have that. Absent that, the other way that you could have it is by consent. So if people say, okay, I'm happy to give that to you, that's why we're giving this mandatory versus voluntary disclosure, right? So I think the link went out into the chat, so you can take a look at it now. And the other thing comment is consent alone may not be sufficient. I will say that voluntary, if you're not saying, and there's no coercion to it, and you're just saying, we would like to know for our own audit purposes as to which of our employees are vaccinated, and you provide that, there's far less risk there, as opposed to a mandatory disclosure of your vaccination status. So next slide, please. So in terms of if we wanted to have a policy on disclosure of vaccination status, and again, as I said, we want to have some sort of legal authority for that, which isn't there yet. So we're looking to a statute, a public health order. This is sort of the same things that you're going to be considering when it even comes to your other policies. You're going to develop a written one. You're going to advise them of the policy, because the policy is only so good as your employees know about it. And then we're moving into privacy territory. So only collect information that is necessary to meet the purpose. Share only, not with Bob's nosy colleagues, but with the people who need to know, right? So whoever's in charge of that organization. And some of this is kind of missed sometimes about, well, where are you storing it? Is it properly protected? When can we get rid of it? So if the employee is no longer there, then you want to think about when it is appropriate to destroy that confidential information. So next participant poll is, do you think it's okay? We're moving now again to, well, we had disclosure, we've had mandatory, and then we want to try to incentivize. Do we think it's okay? I'll just let the results come up. And I'm thinking that we're not thinking of $1 million incentivizations. Interesting. So we're about split between all three, yes, no, and unsure. So from a legal perspective, as an employment lawyer, the answer is probably okay. And there, again, are always exceptions, because what's my keyword? Fact specific. So the reason why I say it's more or less okay is it's not illegal to do that. Otherwise, our government would be in trouble for offering this crazy amount of money for us to get vaccinated. Where you could get into some issues is, again, say Bob, religious reasons, he doesn't want to get vaccinated. You're essentially discriminating against him. So whatever the incentivization is, he can't get it. So there's ways to mitigate against that. So for instance, if you're giving them I would love this, like a gift certificate to Made by Marcus for ice cream. It's starting to get hot again. Just give it to him. Right? So you're not discriminating against him. It becomes harder if you're giving them an incentivization that, hey, you no longer need to wear a mask at work, right? Because then you can see that Bob doesn't have that incentivization. So that's why I say generally, yes, but give thought to how do you just even the playing field so that you're not going to be faced with a human rights complaint that you've discriminated against me. So that was sort of the substantive content that we wanted to cover. And I know that we're going to just do, I love the word key takeaways. This is something our firm just, it's such a buzzword for us, but I'll let Yvonne take away the key takeaways first.
Perfect. Just a quick reminder to pop your questions into the chat, because we're going to be getting to those shortly. Sorry, go ahead, Yvonne.
Yeah, I'll talk about the key takeaways, a couple of them and more now, of course, after listening to the employment standards, human rights, privacy elements of it. There's a lot of planning that has to be done. And under OHS legislation, you have the obligation to keep your workers safe. And if you have 5 or more workers, then you'll have a a representative under the occupational health and safety legislation. If you have more than 20 workers, then you'll have a whole committee. So you've got people that are empowered to help you as an employer make these plans and procedures and processes and help you communicate to your workers. So that's my takeaway under that is if you have an obligation to have these processes and plans in place, then if the incentives are going to work, maybe that's an answer for you. As you see, about half of you thought that was a good idea. But it's key to make these policies. And of course, know the refuse to work framework under the OHS and be prepared for that as well. Be prepared and don't get caught in that with something that you don't know. So these are all very clearly stated, and the information is available. There's lots of information on this. My only caution is, and I did mention constitutional law earlier, the intersection of constitutional law is this: we're all in Alberta. So the Alberta laws apply to us. So just because Ontario does something doesn't mean it applies here. So you have to be very provincial specific in what is your requirement as an employer. And the other takeaway I'm getting from the chat is there's a big difference between what we're talking about here today as to employers' duties under this legislation to its workers and other kinds of contractual things that you nonprofit organizations get involved in. So things that are inside your contracts with your suppliers and contracts with your funders. I mean, that is all a totally separate area than what we're talking about here. And that certainly, I think, more so than this area of law, which is mostly legislated, the whole area of contracts involved in vaccinations and COVID-19 is the area of tort and negligence and contract law, something beyond the scope of this presentation. But I think your questions are very good, and I think we should consider doing some further research in this area to help you with those basic questions that you're having as well. So that's my takeaway from all your chat. Thank you.
And I'll pick up on what I think my key takeaways are. I love this double negative. I can't help it. I'm a lawyer. Mandatory vaccination policies are not without risk. So, or you can just say mandatory vaccination policies are risky. You should think about it and really try to make sure that there is a reason specific to your organization that is going to outweigh the rights under human rights or under privacy in terms of implementing that. So that's why I dive into the human rights implications and then as well as privacy implications with respect to even collecting or mandating that your employees tell you what their vaccination status is. So if I were to sum it up in a couple of keywords, fact specific and balancing. So this is a balancing act. And I think the last thing I would leave with, this is a really new area, right? And things are moving fast. As Yvonne said, Alberta law, we don't have Alberta law yet on vaccinations being mandatory or anything like that. So we're going to see some new and interesting cases come out. And so stay tuned, and there might be more that we could possibly present maybe in a year from now, or maybe cross fingers COVID will be something that we talked about in passing and not be at the forefront anymore.
All right. And so as we are lawyers, of course, we have a disclaimer here. As Yvonne and Melissa mentioned, this is a rapidly evolving area of law. So just bring that out there. And I would like to thank Melissa and Yvonne so much for the informative presentation. I would also like to just take a second to thank our co-hosts, ECVO and Fuse Social, for helping to make this possible. And now we will get to the questions. There were tons of questions in the chat, so thank you so much for participating. Just stop sharing my screen here for a second. Okay, so we did have some questions come in through registration. When people registered, they submitted some questions. So we'll start with a couple of those. Actually, there was a quick one that I'll just ask Yvonne first. Can you just clarify whether the definition of worker under OHS, does that include contractors as well?
if you have any doubt about any definition under the OHS Act, or if it applies to you, because, you know, the term contractor even could be broad. I'm not sure exactly what the relationship is you're describing. Call the 1-800-OHS hotline, and you know, obviously the phone number's on the OHS website, but it's also in our toolkit. They're very definition specific, that legislation.
Perfect. Okay, so now to get to some of those ones that were submitted earlier, and this kind of touches on what you were talking about, making it maybe broader than just employee concerns, but can workers ask the clients they serve to disclose their vaccination status? It's a question we got a few times.
So that has a lot to do with privacy, really. I guess, I mean, the overreaching thing is, you as an employer, no matter what you're doing, you have an obligation to keep your workers safe. So you start with that. You have an obligation to keep the workers safe. How are you going to do that? Policies and procedures. You know, what is your policy on third parties coming into your office, even if they're your clients? And then if they are your quote clients or people you serve, then if you are collecting that and they give it to you, then that's the privacy element of it. So big balancing act, right? But the paramount thing is, you as an employer, and this is what we're talking about here, have the duty to keep your workers safe from hazards. And I'll just have another thing that is important here in this discussion is, one of the hazards could be bullying and harassment of employees, and you need a policy on that too. Think about the potential harassment that might go on in the vaccination COVID-19 thing. So how are you going to address that? But generally, privacy, Melissa, when you got people coming in and they're your clients, was there an effect on that?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Yvonne said. I don't know how many of you have had offices open, and we're not asking for vaccination status, but we're asking, have you been out of the country? Do you have a runny nose? Whatever the laundry list of symptoms are, you are collecting private information. So you need to keep in mind, well, what are you doing with it? How are you disposing it? How are you then protecting it? And when are you going to get rid of it? That was mainly for contact tracing purposes, right? But it's really no different than asking for vaccination status. So everything Yvonne said is that it's really encompassing, well, we want to make sure that our people and our workers are kept safe.
Great. Okay, next question. Do the liability risk or legal responsibilities of employer shift when its workers work with youth under 12 who are not yet eligible for a vaccine? So they're potentially exposed, I guess. Any thoughts on that one?
And is the context that our workers would be exposed because the children can't be vaccinated? Is that the context around that?
That's what I'm getting from it. I think, you know, if you have an obligation to keep your workers safe, but potentially the participants aren't vaccinated, then what are the implications of that?
To me, I don't think it's much different than what Yvonne and I have been discussing about keeping our workers safe. If you want to take it a step farther, are we actually talking about saying no to providing services? Because that's sort of, if say all of your fail-safes of even going so far as to put up or things like that, but you just don't feel that you can keep your workers safe. I think consider that we've talked a lot about human rights implications with your workers, denying services on the basis of say that the person, this one is the age, right? Your remunerated ground of why the person can't get vaccinated is age, which is the protected ground under human rights. We can start treading, and as I say, this is such a high level, but we can go into that whole discussion as well. But I think overarching, the discussion that Yvonne and I just had would be applicable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, this brings another party kind of into the mix. So can funders make it a requirement as part of their agreements that staff would be vaccinated? So for example, if they're providing services supporting Alberta Health Services or something of that nature, is that something that funders could ask for?
again, we're talking about employers' duties here, right? So don't forget, and what this kind of question would be another whole discussion. Again, funders make a contract with you, right? So this is contract law, two parties to the contract. So it doesn't have anything to do with the legislated stuff we're talking about today, but it's something to consider. But it's a contract, right, Melissa?
I'm remembering back to contract 101.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So this is more to do with the employment side. So could you speak a little bit more about the duty to accommodate? So when an employee can refuse work, if they've been working from home, can they refuse to come back into the office? Maybe speak a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I think the key thing with the duty to accommodate is that it is only triggered if their reasons are based on a protected ground. I keep using the word enumerated ground, protected ground. So the ones that are be most common in COVID would be religious or some sort of medical condition that they're contraindicated so they can't get the vaccine, which means that they don't feel comfortable coming into work. So if it's not that, if it's simply that your employee is saying, I don't want to come in because frankly, I'm comfortable at home and I just think I'm as productive. That's a whole other discussion that we could spend quite a bit of time discussing that, but your duty to accommodate is not triggered. So when you're dealing with someone who's like for religious reasons and you need to accommodate, then again, fact specific, you're going to take, when I'm giving advice to clients on accommodation, is that be as creative as possible and come up with like a whole bunch of different options and then talk to the employee. It is not a one way, you're going to be accommodated this way. It's going to involve some investigating to get behind, well, what can this person do and what some medical advice is there, and then coming up with that person, not telling them, this is what we've planned to bring you to where is the accommodation.
Right, yeah. Okay, so on that vein, just to like make accommodations and make the workplace safe using administrative controls and PPE, is there any reason why an employer couldn't require masks and distancing indefinitely? Could they just make that their policy, or is there any kind of reason why not?
That's a good question.
I could think of a reason if then there's a medical condition that they can't wear a mask, right? So you're kind of flipping it on its head. So I'd say in general, no, but there could be that instance. I was in, a shop the other day and someone wasn't wearing a mask and it really threw my kids off, went them for a loop, but maybe they had a reason that they can't wear a mask, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then we're going down that path of discrimination on an enumerated ground. If it's simply because they don't wish to wear a mask, that's quite different. Mm-hmm. Right. So if you have your policies and procedures and you've blasted it out to them, they agree to them, they will be bound by them. You can initiate discipline to say, thou shalt abide by my policies and procedures. And absent a reason to accommodate, you're going to be going down some sort of improvement plan to change that behavior.
Right. Yeah. So it's almost the flip side of requiring people to get vaccinated.
There's so many parallels here, such as, there's no, aren't supposed to wear perfume in an office, Right. The flip side of, people are now supposed to wear masks. So what's reasonable here? Each employment situation, each employer will be different, and, your policies are made by your workers and you. So, everyone should get involved in this policy creation, so everyone's happy with the results, or they felt they participated. Top-down approach, I don't think is going to work here in the nonprofit sector anyway.
Yeah, that's an important point. People have to have their concerns heard for sure. So we're getting a couple of questions about sort of like liability concerns. If you do implement a mandatory vaccination policy, would there be any responsibility for like side effects or things that could arise from people getting the vaccine? Or on the flip side, if somebody contracts COVID at the workplace, is there any liability exposure there for the employer?
Okay, well, we're talking about, you know, a couple of things. The regulated kind of things like OHS. If something happens, then the act has, you know, repercussions if you didn't follow all the rules. But then we're talking about the tort liability. You know, that's commercial general liability or insurance, things like that. That's the subject of a whole other topic we could talk about. General liability of what happens in your workplace. Same as if someone trips on a cord in your hallway. You know, it's someone comes into your workplace, gets COVID. What are their abilities to get compensation from you? The next topic we do talk about, if we're talking about this, we're going to have our insurance experts with us on the panel as well.
Yeah, somebody just mentioned if there's an upcoming liability possible presentation. So that is something we will keep in mind for sure. There's lots of concerns and questions and anxieties around this and uncertainties. So I think we're seeing that come through with all of the different questions and needs for advice. So do you have any kind of general words of reassurance, I guess, for our participants today?
Melissa, you go first.
All right, I just saw people like insurance advice, please. I think check your policy. This is such a different realm than employment law. I agree with Yvonne that really treading into like tort liability. Funny story, I didn't know what a tort was until I was in Tort 101. Anyhow, so I think you want to make sure that your workplace is as safe as possible, right? So if you're not having hand washing stations, you don't have hand sanitizer, you're not having masking, you're not allowing for physical distancing, you're more likely to be seeing some sort of liability as opposed to you're taking all the precautions. As Yvonne said, there's a lot to be talked about in that, and particularly from an insurance point of view.
My general comment would be, you know, don't worry, don't stress about this. I mean, due diligence is a good word we use as lawyers a lot. You know, if you've planned and you've done everything that you possibly can with the resources that you have, and you've made a good attempt and you've to comply, and you have your something in writing, policies and procedures, then you've come a long way. And watch the best practices that come out from the business community. You know, in Alberta, watch what happens in our province amongst other groups. There'll be things happening. So, you know, be prepared to, you know, copy what is going on that looks like a best practice for you. Seriously, you don't need to reinvent the wheel in this. And, you know, we will be as proactive as we can at IntegralOrg. We understand that nonprofit organizations need this information desperately. So thank you for coming today.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I know there were tons of questions that we didn't have a chance to get to. So if you do really want an answer from Melissa or Yvonne on your specific question, feel free to send an email to admin@integralorg.ca, and we'll do our best to get to your question. And again, just feel free to reach out to IntegralOrg by phone call or just by email at any time if you feel like you need help. So we really appreciate the participation today. It's been wonderful. And I think that everybody here is on the right track in seeking out information. So that's great to see.